Okay, great. So hello, I am Dr. Elizabeth Bowman. I'm gonna jump to my little slides since we only have a few minutes here. I am faculty in the social work program at Gallaudet University. We serve primarily deaf and hard of hearing students, although in the graduate program it's about 50-50, but we sign all of our lectures, so you do need to be sign fluent if you're coming to our university. I worked in child welfare for a long time, and in the recent years, I've been working on a grant with the DC OVSJG. It's the Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants, providing services to people who have come out of prison after a long prison term. So myself and my colleague, Jaemi Hagen, are going to be presenting on the experiences of deaf individuals in the criminal justice system. Jaemi, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Jaemi Hagen. I just graduated from Gallaudet this past May, and I am on the board of directors, and I've had previous research experience in criminal justice here and also in language acquisition.
So we are going to be talking today about the experiences of deaf adults in the criminal justice system. This includes arrest, trial, incarceration, and reentry back into the community. I'm not going to jump into all of these stats. You can look at our slides later if you want additional information, but we're going to kind of buzz through them pretty quickly. So lots of people in prison in the US. We all know this. This is a pretty common statistic, but deaf adults represent nearly 1 million Americans total, but in the United States, but we really have no idea how many deaf people are in prison or interacting with criminal justice systems, because that's not something that's required to be tracked. And it was only 4 years ago that the Supreme Court said that the Americans with Disabilities Act had to be applied to parole. So we know that there's some gaps in the criminal justice system in terms of serving deaf adults. So again, each of these steps through the criminal justice system, whether you interact with one or all of them, should be providing specific services. And we'll go into that a little bit more later with our recommendations and implications. I do want to just give a couple of cultural pieces first. In our paper, if you read it, it'll show the term deaf with a capital D versus deaf with a lowercase d. So you'll see D/D. And that is because those are two separate designations. So the idea of a culturally deaf person, so a person who's fluent in sign language, who has sort of the cultural norms and an identity as a deaf person, part of the deaf community, versus a person who just has hearing loss and may or may not have that cultural identity piece, which, you know, hearing loss is a factor in both designations, but the cultural considerations are different when we're talking about a cultural group. So again, there's specific considerations during each step. Ensuring that there's access for communication, that people's hands aren't handcuffed when arrested, those sorts of things, and being aware of the specific, like, use of hand gestures and things for communication are important considerations during arrest. And again, I'm going to just kind of jump through this section so we can get to implications, because that's fun. But the legal definition of linguistic incompetence. Now, this is important because a lot of deaf folks who are in the prison system have been identified as linguistic, as having a diagnosis of linguistic incompetence. So this means essentially a person who doesn't have language of any kind. And because of the high incidence of deaf children who are deprived of language growing up, right? If you have hearing families that don't learn sign language and the kids are not, taught sign language through their deaf schools or so forth, then there's this deprivation of language that kids can grow up without any exposure to language, which actually affects cognitive development, it affects social development, and the importance of language for young children is cannot be overstated. So what this means is that a person who has a designation of linguistic incompetence can't understand written English or lip reading because they don't speak English, and they also don't speak sign language, ASL. So, which this means through the criminal justice process, they may not understand anything that's happening to them through each step of the process. It's relevant because, we see that child abuse, neglect, and adverse childhood experiences are often intersecting with language deprivation. And they are also often intersecting with, growing up to have interaction with the criminal justice system. So a person who has a lot of child abuse, trauma, and so forth is more likely than someone without those traumas to end up incarcerated, right? Like we have some intersecting features with the ACEs and incarceration. Same is true with ACEs and language deprivation. So this means that it's a potentially high risk consideration, right? That folks that are in jail, and like I said, we've got this citation here about 46 to 50% of deaf inmates may be, or defendants may have linguistic incompetence. This means that for those who are interacting with deaf individuals in the criminal justice system, it's important to assess their actual understanding of language, whether it's written English or signed, and having interpreters who know how to assess that and how to pick up on that language level. If the person's actually understanding what's being signed, potentially having a hearing interpreter and also a certified deaf interpreter can be a piece of that. But there's a number of different sort of implications we'll talk about in a minute. But linguistic incompetence is something that comes up a lot in the literature about criminal justice issues for deaf adults. So again, making sure that there's language access, interpretation. If lawyers are not signers, making sure that they're comfortable interacting with interpreters. And one thing that comes up quite a bit is folks being pressured into accepting a guilty plea or a settlement without actually understanding what it is that they're admitting to or signing off on. We do give quite a bit of recommendations related to how to engage with folks in jails and prisons. This is both related to facilities and materials that are provided, as well as staff training. But it's really important for anyone who's providing services to deaf individuals to make sure that everything that is provided to the hearing folks is accessible to the deaf folks too. That's the long and short of it. So again, we're going to sort of list some of these things later in our implication section. So I'm going to jump forward here. And then, providing parole and support at parole hearings, as well as making sure that folks understand what they're signing off on. So, right, like we may be pressured to sign off on a guilty plea. We also may think, oh, okay, I'm going to get out if I sign this, but I don't actually know what I'm agreeing to. And so there's a higher risk of parole violations and then returning back to prison for that reason. All right, Jaemi, you wanna jump in here?
Yeah, for sure. So now that we know what the issue is, what are the implications and recommendations that we have? And one of the first things we can do is make facilities more accessible. And we can do this by putting devices and equipment in spaces such as courtrooms, police departments, jails and prisons, and other facilities, detention centers, that will make it more accessible. Some examples are flashing light alarms and visual alert systems. The photo on your lower right side is an example of a doorbell light alarm that will flash when somebody rings the doorbell. So that's a way for people to see, oh, there's somebody at the door, or a fire alarm, oh, there's a fire alarm going off. So having those visual devices there will make it more accessible. Another example is if there's TVs in the room that's displaying some information or conveying some important details that should be known, that those TVs should have closed captioning on them, just like your TV at home or at work, just having those captions so that a deaf person can understand what's going on in that time and space. Another example is video phone access, which is something that can be installed in any setting: schools, hospitals, prisons, jails, anywhere. The photo on the upper right with the camera and remote, that's an example of a video phone device, and that can be put anywhere. And there's a lot of video phone companies that are available for deaf users and deaf individuals, where those devices can be installed for free or for a low cost in employee situations in jails and prisons and any public setting, really. So those are ways that deaf individuals can have access to calling family members, friends, anybody they need to call and get a hold of in a way that they can communicate properly. It's like us, people who use their phones, their cell phones, they're talking on the phones, but for a deaf individual, they need to be able to use sign language. And that's what they would use, video phones. So having access to that is really important. Another thing is making sure they have American Sign Language interpreters or sign language interpreters available in the courtrooms or in jails and prisons, or if there's some event or some programming going on in a jail and prison facility or detention center, making sure that those ASL interpreters are provided to them, and also visual materials, whether that be a copy of a PowerPoint or a copy of whatever materials are going to be provided, or some visual way for them to see and access that information. In jails, detention centers, prison facilities, anything like that, there should be deaf units so that if there's more than one deaf individual in the facility, they can be grouped together so they can have that support network and they can communicate with each other. Because if a deaf individual is placed in a hearing environment, they're going to have a harder time communicating with them, and it's going to be more of a barrier for them to be able to figure out what's going on around them and what they need to do. So making sure that there's that community, that unit for them to connect is really important too. Lastly, another example is CART, which is closed captioning, which can be used in the court systems, could also be used in educational settings. So really it can be used anywhere. So it could be used in jails and prisons. And the photo on the lower left is an example of what that would look like. Is somebody typing what's going on, who's saying what, and when they're saying it. And then the person who's deaf can see it on a computer screen or an iPad or a phone. And that's a way that they can read what's going on. And that could be a good alternative if sign language interpreters aren't available too. So there's lots of different options for how we can make it accessible. We'll go to the next slide, please. The next piece here is training and education. So making sure that staff and professionals such as police officers, dispatchers, first responders, and anybody who works in prison and jail facilities is trained, including parole officers and correctional officers as well, making sure that they can understand and recognize the cultural and linguistic differences within the deaf community and with deaf individuals, and also how to interact and communicate effectively with individuals who are deaf. These trainings should include how to use touch and gesture to get that person's attention, teaching them the basics of ASL so that if a situation arose where they needed to use ASL to communicate, they could at least know the basic signs in ASL to communicate with that person. And also how to react and respond in situations where a deaf person might not be responding to verbal cues or to verbal communication, whether it be they've got their back turned and not facing that person, or that officer or somebody is yelling across the room, or that person who is saying something does not realize that person is deaf. How can they respond and react in those situations to get that person's attention without potentially escalating the situation and putting that person at risk, or causing some miscommunication of some sort? So these are the things that should be involved in trainings that are provided to professionals who work in the criminal justice system. We'll go to the next slide. And lastly, really increased awareness is going to be a huge factor as well, because having this greater awareness of the needs of deaf individuals in the criminal justice system is really important, in that it'll help reduce the risk of various things, including police brutality, wrongful incarceration, solitary confinement, and recidivism as a result of parole violation. So being able to inform staff and professionals in the community and in the professional settings who work with these populations, work with deaf individuals, is really going to help us be able to minimize the risk and the impacts on deaf individuals in the criminal justice system, whether that's trainings, whether that's, bringing in somebody who's deaf and some competency training, or really just focusing and emphasizing the need for awareness around deaf individuals and what their needs are and how we can provide greater access and accessibility to them in these facilities.